Good evening. My name is Grace Shores, and my campaign is on the topic of improving protective orders. These are necessary tools in ensuring the safety of many survivors of family violence, which includes domestic violence and intimate partner violence. Specifically, in my community, I would like to help educate survivors on how to get a protection order and provide them support through getting one. My campaign proposes the creation of a team of family abuse survivor advocates who specialize in dealing with the courts and the process of protective orders that will help prevent re-victimization. Although there is already support like this available, I propose that the emphasis on a restraining order and receiving one easier will immediately ease a distressed survivor in order to get them to safety. With my proposed improvement to the restraining order system, courts, police, and advocates must work together to make this process more suitable for protecting all survivors and educating all involved on family violence. With this campaign, my community would become safer and more understanding of the effects and consequences of domestic violence. I reference Goslin's Heavy Hands book throughout my presentation, and my campaign can prevent violence with the quick assuredness of safety for the victim with diligent and consistent education on the issue that will work to normalize this conversation and reduce the violence's effects on the community over time. Restraining orders are also known as injunctions or protective orders. Currently, they are court-ordered and support survivors with provisions that restrict contact with the abuser, forbid any more abuse, intimidation, or harassment, and prohibits the perpetrator's right to own a firearm. In the book Heavy Hands, the author writes how these are the most significant legislative changes against domestic violence due to their effectiveness in ensuring the safety of survivors, as research has found that women are more likely to report to the courts than they are to reporting to the police. Violation of a protective order by the abuser is a criminal offense that most often leaves them with a misdemeanor. Who should be protected by restraining orders and what kinds of abuse should be covered? Although all forms of abuse should be covered under the protection of these restraining orders, currently physical abuse is covered mostly due to its provability with the evidence left on a victim's body. My campaign proposes that all survivors of intimate partner abuse and domestic violence should seek help and support on their restraining order against their abuser, whether they were abused physically, emotionally, or sexually. Goslin states that domestic violence advocates will provide legal advocacy such as assistance with obtaining protective orders. The author also writes that it is the police officer's duty to enforce these orders. Education on these service providers, along with accessibility to these services, help ensure women and survivors of their safety through this measure of protection. With my proposal, I want survivors to be able to access a version of a protective order when they are abused emotionally or sexually. Because these are harder to prove, different variations of protection orders should be created with different provisions for each. Not only should the perpetrator have to leave their victim alone with the evidence that the survivor is in extreme distress by a trained family abuse advocate, the abuser should be required to also be educated on domestic violence in general. I'd like to reiterate that the stress levels of survivors should be evidence enough for trained professionals in trauma-informed care. It does not need, this education does not need to be targeted as to further upset an abuser. Rather, this education and information should be normalized into people's thinking. It can appear in all forms, such as pamphlets through the mail, billboards around town, or mandatory classes if the protection order is serious enough. Filing for an order should not be the action to take after enduring horrible abuse. The escalation of abuse in order to file does not help survivors. Touching on the levels of prevention this campaign will use, this information should be taught starting when children are young and continue throughout their schooling. This normalization of information is key to preventing family violence victimization, and accessing this tool before serious damage occurs helps survivors. Filing a complaint that is taken seriously, no matter the level of abuse, should be able to be met with a protective order as abusers need to be held accountable for all of their actions. It is time we protect our survivors and listen to them immediately. This campaign is a call to action for the courts, social workers, and criminal justice workers to put survivors first and put their safety as a priority. All survivors of intimate partner abuse and domestic violence can seek help and support on their restraining order against their abusers. Education on these service providers, along with accessibility to these services, will help ensure women and survivors of their safety through this measure. Protective orders should work to protect the survivors that need them, but also work to benefit them further as well, with the information to both parties on domestic violence. With the consequence of a restraining order, even for minor abuses, along with education to follow on why family violence may occur and its consequences, we create a community that is safer for survivors and that is no longer tolerant of abuse at all. My campaign will also address concerns about domestic violence, including its myths. Physical abuse has seemingly been put as a standard for abuse with the current provisions of a restraining order. I want it to be clear that enduring emotional abuse is just as qualifying a reason to need an order of protection. A survivor coming to a professional that can decipher true distress and trauma will be able to assist a survivor in getting the legal protection they need and that they also deserve. This notion of distress should be evidence enough, at least for a light consequence of a variation of a restraining order. According to Gosselin, 1 in 3 women experience intimate partner violence, yet many do not seek out restraining orders. My campaign to normalize the conversation about this type of violence will help educate women on their situation and thus how she can help herself. With given and known resources provided from schools, emails, billboards, women can be aware of this tool that can provide them with immediate safety, along with it being more accessible. Reporting through the courts or with the help of a survivor advocate could be beneficial instead of going to the police to receive justice. In order for these protective orders to be accessible, they must also be free to file. Gosselin writes about delivery fees being imposed on survivors in rural towns. Changes must be made so that survivors of all incomes can file for protection, or there must be money set aside for survivors by advocates or by the government to complete the fulfillment of their safety. Also mentioned in the book is the notion that the enforcement of the protections can be rare. There must be police reform that emphasizes abuse and domestic violence situations that police are so often called into. My campaign of easier access and more frequent use of restraining orders uses a mixture of 3 levels of prevention. Primary prevention includes educating all ages of the dangers of intimate partner abuse. Interventions of the offender, along with the actual disciplinary action like a misdemeanor for violating a restraining order, are examples of secondary prevention. Tertiary prevention involves the safety planning of the survivor after the order is administered and further investigation into further. Let me back up. I'm sorry. And further investigation into the needs of the survivor. In this presentation, I referenced Gosselin's Heavy Hands book to support my prevention campaign using restraining orders to protect but also empower survivors to be believed and to lead their own lives. Thank you.